Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Couple of Nukes. As always, I'm your host, Mr. Whiskey, and I have been working in addiction recovery for a few years now. And during that time, I have come across many individuals working in addiction recovery as well, from professional doctors to authors to recovering addicts themselves. It has been an amazing journey seeing people as old as their 70s with 30 plus years of addiction achieve sobriety. It has been a true blessing from God to work in this field. And I say all that to preface this conversation with the book title I saw today that was sent to me was probably one of my favorite book titles. I've read a lot of books from podcast guests and came across, but this title, God Doesn't Relapse, that instantly just hit a place in my heart personally. As the son of addiction, as a online minister, I really love that. And so I've been very excited for this conversation here with the author, Matt Grace, who is just doing amazing things. And I can't wait to get into this conversation with you. Mr. Grace, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure, and my responsibility to give back, to be on podcasts, basically to do anything to try to help people. I've been sober for 21 years. October 3rd, 2004, 6:30 in the morning was when I got on my knees and I surrendered to God and begged him for help. Now, I didn't start working in the field until about year 7 or year 8 of my sobriety. I had started volunteering early on, and it really was drilled into me by the men that I respected how important service was and how important volunteer work was. And as someone who grew up on third base and was very spoiled and entitled, service work changed my life and it gave me a fresh perspective on how many people are struggling out there. And someone always has it worse than I do, which helps me every day. So I started out working for a nationally recognized private practice in Michigan, and I would fly people to and from treatment. And then I would spend a one-on-one time with them as their sober mentor, taking them to meetings, going to lunch with them, a mixture of sobriety, recovery, and some fun as well. And after I worked for this private practice, I started my own practice called Saving Grace. And we primarily worked with high net worth families in Palm Beach, Greenwich, Connecticut, New York City, and the Midwest. And the reason why I say that is because, unfortunately, the ancillary services in the addiction space are not covered by insurance. So, you have to pay bills, and we ended up working with families who could afford to pay us. And so I closed the practice, my business partner and I, because a lot of the families couldn't adhere to very simple boundaries, and they themselves were sicker than the addict that they were related to. And that's really why I wrote my book, is to try to reach families to destigmatize alcoholism and drug addiction. My father swept my addiction under the rug and wore rose-colored glasses when everybody was telling him that I had a problem. So I thought by writing this book, I would reach a much broader audience than just the wealthy people that I was trying to help, because I believe I was spared to help that specifically those who are less fortunate than me. That's what really drives me. But I want to reach families. I want to teach them how to create boundaries. You don't have to throw someone out right away. I mean, it took my mom 13 years to do that, but you can love someone from a distance. I want to teach families not to, there's a saying, families are loving their kids, parents are loving their kids to death.
Mm.
Right? And so my father couldn't get out of his own way. He wasn't a bad guy. He did the best that he could, but he wasn't my father. He was my best friend. And I'm trying to teach parents not to be their kids' friends, but to be their parent. And I'll just finish with this and you can hop back in. The worst thing that you can do for your child is to destroy their ambition. And that's what I saw in my own life and a lot of the other families that I worked with. And it's not just rich people, it's families that just do too much for their kids. And then the young men, primarily who I worked with, they had something called a failure to launch into adulthood.
Mm.
And So I said I was 29 years old, but I felt like a little boy. So really, this book is about it's half memoir but half case study. So in between each chapter of my memoir, there's something called an interlude, which is italicized. And there's a lot of case studies, almost like a workbook for families to go through.
Mm. There's a lot to unpack from what you said there, and number one, this is a very relatable conversation, something that resonates not just with me, but with a lot of people. You know, the statistics are always changing. Last I had heard, they said about 1 in 7 people are affected by addiction. And I think it's even more than that. I've yet to meet someone who doesn't know someone struggling with addiction. You know, it's become so common and spread, and it's getting worse and worse. But at the same time, on the fortunate side, we see the revitalization, the growing of a lot of new resources to help prevent addiction, to intervene on addiction, and to recover from addiction. So I think that is the flip side to that. What you talk about with enablement, it is huge. You know, we talk a lot on the show about that. It's one of the number one factors behind addiction, which is, you know, people not holding one another accountable and having enablement and mistaking love and enablement. You know, they don't have to be synonymous. And Dr. Brian LeQuanon, a addiction recovery expert who came on the show, he called it in terms of military terms of being held emotionally hostage by the addict. You know, you are being held emotionally hostage by them, and because of those ties, you know, you're enabling. And you look at, I think one of the great examples is the show My 600 Pound Life, right? All those people who are 600 or more pounds, they always have a partner who is feeding them, who is taking them to these places, who is enabling them. And that's what it's about. And we talk about when it comes with that enablement, you mentioned boundaries, which is super important. And people often struggle to find a balance. And I was actually featured in a book where I wrote about a lot of people talk about forgive and forget, and they don't follow that. They actually follow forgive and resent, which is they forgive the person and they still hold it against them. I talked about forgive and protect. And in that, I break down forgiving and protecting, setting boundaries, and still having a relationship. And I used a personal example of my father, who was an addict, and I used to enable him. I used to be an enabler because I loved him. I wanted to prevent him from feeling the pain and consequences of his actions for his sake, for the sake of those around us, keeping the family together. And at some point, it was really costing myself. It was putting me into danger physically, emotionally. And so I had to set boundaries. And it was very difficult to do, but I was able to do it successfully. And I still have a relationship with my father. We still call on the phone. I still go see him. But if he's drinking or doing drugs to a certain degree or at all, I don't see him. And I've had to abandon him on holidays. I've had to cancel my birthday trips to see him, but it's part of that tough love. And I tell you what, when I had to leave him for those holidays, a lot of those times served as wake-up calls where he realized the depth of the actions that he was partaking in. And that's one of the things when you keep preventing the consequences, keep preventing the pain, then the addict doesn't see a reason to stop what they're doing, right? If they're getting all the benefits of what their addiction is helping them cope with or suppressing or whatever way it's making them feel, and there are no consequences, there's no incentive to stop other than people saying you should stop. And so I think we've talked on the show before about letting addicts hit the rock bottom. And sometimes their rock bottom is much further than a normal rock bottom because of the way the addiction captivates them. And so I want to backtrack to you, Mr. Grace, about you talked about being an addict, about family members enabling you. Again, enablement not being malicious or intentful, but the result of, you know, familiar relationships, societal responsibilities, fill in the blank. What put you into addiction in the first place?
So it's important to understand that, listen, the word trauma today, I think it's overused and misunderstood. I'm a big believer. Everybody's experienced trauma, not just alcoholics, right? And I did have a lot of trauma in my life, but you also have to look at my family history and the genetic makeup of my family. And if you can Google it and look at ChatGPT, but 40 to 60% of alcoholics have the predisposed gene. And my grandmother was an alcoholic. Her two siblings were an alcoholic. My great grandfather was an alcoholic. And what happens is sometimes it skips generations and it's like my sisters, for instance, fine. Me, the first time that I used anything, it was Ritalin, actually. My best friend, it was a summer, it was a June. beautiful day in Michigan, and he said, "Hey, get over here." He crushed a pill of Ritalin and said, "Snort this," and I snorted it. That was it. I talk about that being a gift from the gods. The amphetamine, I called it amphetamine bliss. And I said to myself, if I could capture this feeling that I have right now and feel this way every day for the rest of my life, then this is exactly what I've been looking for. And unfortunately, everybody's tolerance and, like you said, their bottom or their story is a bit different. But I started at 16, and by 18, I was a full-blown crystal meth addict. So I had graduated from Ritalin to meth, and that was just, that almost killed me very quickly.
Right. I know we've talked about the genetic prepositions, and I know for me personally, my father has always harped on me saying, Mr. Whiskey, you can never drink because, I was an addict, and then he'll name all these family members. And so, was there any teaching in your household like, hey, son, we have this family history, you should be cautious? Was there any like warning to you?
No, because my father, nobody on his side of the family had any issues. And ironically, neither of my parents ever drank or used drugs.
Mm,
And so my mom, there wasn't a warning because my grandmother was a functional alcoholic. So she didn't start drinking till 5 o'clock. Hence, there's a nasty vodka brand called 5 o'clock vodka. It's one of the low grade vodkas out there. But so she just became muted, right? So alcohol does things to people's personalities, right? There's a distinct change in
right.
personality. I get mean and violent. Some people become happy and jovial. Other people become sullen and withdrawn. My grandmother was the type who became sullen and withdrawn and just stopped speaking.
Mm,
But I
okay.
found that out later.
For me, what's most interesting, and obviously this is anything we should teach our children, is that if someone invites you over and just says, "Hey, snort this," we should say, "Wait a minute, what is this? Let me look it up first." I mean, you talk about no hesitation, you kind of just did it. I don't know if you still remember kind of what was going through your head where you were like, "All right, I trust my friend, so we're going to do this," or do you remember that kind of thought process at all?
Yeah, so there was a this was the pre-party before the party.
Oh, okay.
And so it was all of I call them the rogues gallery of trust fund delinquents. So I knew that these other kids had most of the other kids at this pre-party were more advanced than I was. So a lot of the people that night had taken acid, LSD, and my friend, it wasn't peer pressure, it was just curiosity.
Mm,
Because now maybe it's because I'm ADHD and I took a lot of risks in my life and I had a lot of behavioral issues and faced a lot of serious. I was expelled from two preschools. I misbehaved in school. I was a cruel kid, and I think that there's probably a link to the risks that I took. But it wasn't. Nobody was saying, "Hey, do this. You're not going to be cool if you don't do this." It just kind of was just happened instantly, right? It wasn't even planned. It was just
right.
he's like, here, just do this, and that set me off to the races.
Mm. And then you talked about by 18 being, a full-blown addict. During those teenage years, how are you getting access to these drugs?
Well, so Adderall is the big one now, but when I was in high school, kids were prescribed, a lot of students at my school were prescribed Ritalin.
Mm,
And so there were kids who would just sell it and not take it.
okay.
And, or there were kids, I went to a private school and there was this area where everybody would leave their backpack. And I would go through kids' backpacks to take the Ritalin
Wow.
if I couldn't find someone to sell it to me. But yeah, so a lot of times the kids who didn't like the way they made it feel, make them feel, would sell me the Ritalin and then take that money and buy weed.
Mm,
So, and it's still even with oxys, when oxys first came out, the first person who started selling me oxy would take it from his mom who was a cancer patient.
wow.
So, right, there's always going to unfortunately be someone willing to sell something. But crystal meth did not, I didn't experience that until my freshman year in college. So it was Ritalin until I graduated. And then when I moved out west, that's when meth just completely rocked me.
Okay. And again, we don't share these processes so that you can go replicate them, but so you have a little awareness around how this stuff happens. And one of the most shocking episodes I actually had on this podcast was it's titled something like She Was Her Son's Drug Dealer and Didn't Know. And basically, this woman who was addicted, her son would go into her room and steal some of her drugs and became addicted from just the drugs she had in the house. And so, like you said,
That's common.
people get it. People get it from a lot of different places, and it's very unfortunate that we have these teenagers, these high schoolers, these college students and adults enabling one another, to make a profit. But of course, drugs and alcohol have been a huge profit and financially driven business for a long time. And, I think that what we need to focus on is more prevention. We have a lot of intervention and recovery, but I think we're not hitting the prevention properly, hitting the children and teenagers in the right mindset for this stuff. And unfortunately, that's a hard process to go about, right? Because we have programs in all the schools and high schools. I think for me, it was called DARE, which was what drug and alcohol and
Yeah,
whatever it is.
unfortunately, it was several $100 million program, and what they found was that it caused more interest, and so kids went out and tried drugs.
Right. Yeah. And that's just one example of many
Right.
other programs that they have tried and stuff. So it's really hard to do the prevention. And I think, it comes down to also what they're being taught at home. And I think what I'd love to see more is more scriptural influence in every home. There's a lot of choices that I've made that if I had been more grounded in the teaching and wisdom of the Bible, I wouldn't have done. And there's plenty of scripture against drunkenness and, the associated ailments of addiction. But even then, how we receive the word and how we implement it as children is not always effective. And then from there, you talk about by 18 being fully blown addict and struggling with that. How long did this continue? Did it continue to get progressively worse? Like, what did the next few years kind of shape out to be, especially during your time in college?
So I'll expedite this just because I don't want it to be one big drunkalog. So from 16 to 29, I went to treatment 3 times, had several arrests, wrecked cars, wrecked relationships, wrecked job opportunities. I was a TV reporter for ABC on air. I was drunk and high every day on television as a street
Wow.
reporter. I OD'd in the newsroom in front of all my coworkers in,
Wow.
in South Texas, which is in the summer is 120 degrees. So they thought I had heat stroke. But I
Mm,
burned every bridge in my life. And, you talked about pain. And pain is necessary. Pain is the greatest motivator to change. And I welcomed the pain because, if someone's just going to keep buying me drugs and alcohol, like my father was enabling me, and he was just an open-ended ATM machine. I had to experience deep-rooted spiritual pain to want to be in a position to accept help from another man, right? So I had to put my ego aside and I had to admit that I was a pretty bad manager of my own life and I needed new management, right? And that manager is God.
mm. Right. Now you talk about, so did your father give you the money knowing what you were going to do with it, or he talked kind of like it sounded like he was in denial of your actions, which I think is very common because as a parent, you don't want to think that your child is an addict because one, a lot of us will take it as a reflection on us. What did we do wrong? Why is our child addicted? Or, is there something inherently wrong with our child? So obviously a lot of parents live in denial of their addiction. What was kind of the scenario with your father?
So parents don't know who their children are.
Mm, I agree with that for
That,
sure.
that just let's just start there, right? And my father didn't know who I was. Like I said, he introduced me to a life of prostitution and gambling at a young age.
Mm,
And so I said, I was 16 when he introduced me to prostitution. And I said, that's the night that he ceased being my father and became my best friend. So
agreed. Agreed.
my father looked, and I just posted something on social media that got 1.3 million views about my father buying me a prostitute. I think maybe, hopefully you'll agree with this. I think we're fighting for the soul of our nation, for young men.
100%.
because listen, I don't blame my father. You know, these conversations in my book is not an indictment of his failure. It's a testament to what happens when you turn the other cheek and love someone too much. Right? That's the way that I phrase it because I want people to understand that I don't resent him. He did the best he could, but he was severely flawed. Most of the comments I got from these men were, your father's a legend, your father's a hero, you're gay, how ungrateful, you're an ungrateful son. My father hit me, so therefore my father was a better father because he didn't hit me and he got me that woman. I was just taken back by where we are as a nation, a society,
Mhm.
and as a human race. And I'm not the anti-gambling and prostitution and strip club. I'm not the anti-spokesperson, but I don't think it's something that you should introduce to your children.
So I
It's
actually
not
have.
right. It doesn't sound like rocket science, right?
Right. It sounds pretty basic, but
Right.
unfortunately, what is true morality and immorality is very twisted by society. And I'll give you an example. I posted not too long ago about anti-human trafficking, posting about human trafficking prevention and awareness. And essentially, the woman was talking about how much human trafficking labor is used to make coffee, and the enablement of those companies to keep doing so because of the purchase of the goods, and how many churches unknowingly sell coffee made by human trafficking labor. And so she was talking about churches using, ethically sourced coffee and maybe even having a sign to promote it to bring about awareness because awareness is the first step in prevention. And I had men in the comment section saying, we real men in the church would tear that sign down, go make daddy a cup of coffee because it basically pro human trafficking comments. And anytime I post anything faith-based, I get attacked. And I've had a lot of toxic males attack me for different talks I've had on male sexual assault prevention and awareness and talking about biblical masculinity. And one good example, you talked about people praising and complimenting your father. I've spoken a lot about grooming when it comes to young males because a lot of times young men are taken advantage of by older women. But we always praise this as a good thing. There's this common idea that if you're sexually assaulted by a woman as a man, well, that's a good thing. You're winning. Like you said, terms like legendary, hero, or, if you're not going to play past the controller, I wish I had that. And so we've talked about that, about how like young men who are being taken advantage of by older women, it's always like, oh, if you attracted an older woman, you're winning in life, even if it's unwanted, unconsensual, or whatever it may be. And so I completely understand what your point is. We have such a degrading and immoral society that pushes stripping, that pushes prostitution, I mean, you look at social media, the sexualization has gone so much, and we see people wanting to partake of that with their children because, some of them are marking it as an initiation of manhood. Some fathers, like for example, for yours, perhaps like in that case of getting your son a prostitute, well, I'm just raising my son to be a man, or I'm teaching him about, real masculinity or
Yeah, and
manhood.
he comes from
And,
that old school thought.
right. Right. And unfortunately, we see that nowadays in other terms, in other, social media equivalents with sexualization and whatever it may be. Prior to prostitution, or rather, a more subtle version was some fathers would get their sons Playboy magazines, or nowadays it might be, hey, son, I'm getting you a subscription to an OnlyFans, whichever one you want. Unfortunately, we see that, and it's really just a passing down of values and ideas that are being shaped by society rather than scripture. And so I think, unfortunately, when it comes to social media, we see that reinforcement of those ideas in the comment sections. We see people defending it and praising it and then speaking against you. And so it's really sad to see that decline. I put it at two ends of a spectrum. We have some people trying to make men women. We have some people making men very toxic, aggressive, and abusive people, and not that middle part. And that middle part is what scripture lays out of biblical masculinity, where is a balance of both feminine and masculine characteristics to make an ideal man who lives a righteous life and serves other people. And so, when you talk about your father, what is your relationship with him now, if at all, or like, did you ever confront him at some point?
Now, you see, that's the power of the program that I got sober in. as I've said, I've seen because service changed my life, and that's one of the themes in my book of how important service and volunteer work is. Real quick before I get to that, I wanted to say that there's a crisis in this country for young men, and gambling. The sports apps is wiping out an entire youth, and also porn, like
Yeah.
not just pornography, but OnlyFans. And so I also talk about that because it's not drugs and alcohol, it's gambling and pornography, which are just as can be just as destructive. But and actually, if you go to a morgue, 4 out of 5 suicides are young men. So, and it's not that I don't want to help women, but getting back to my father, he died. When he died, I had 11 years of sobriety. And so one of the things that he finally could do was to pull back the reins of financial help. And, when my mom said, if you're going to get out of my house, and my dad, everybody kind of got together and said, we're done with your BS. And so when they started to hold me accountable, then I started to heal. And I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. I think it's very important to distinguish the fact today that everybody says, well, you got to deal with trauma. Well, but I manipulated my trauma. I used the trauma that I had in my life to keep my parents at bay from trying to corral my addiction. And so because my parents got divorced, the one time that they got together, I started hitting below the belt and attacking my mom because I knew that my dad would join in, or I was appealing to his anger of how she left the family. And so you can be if they're not experienced, right, like addiction professionals are, then it's easy to manipulate your way through and say, "Oh, well, you left the family. I have all this trauma in my life because you left dad, you left me." But the minute
Mm.
I looked in the mirror and and just took accountability for my actions. That's when I started to grow. So I realized that my father did the best that he could, and that was good enough for me because he wasn't malicious in his intent. I think intent is important. I
Right.
realized that he did the best he could with what the tools that he had to be a father, which was not many.
Mm.
Right? My house was the party house. He tried to make me get a job and I would go to the club and play golf. He barely tried to put in boundaries or measures to hold me accountable as a kid, right? There was a blurred line of who was the father and who was the friend. And so my book is really trying to help families not destroy their kids' ambition, help them to launch into an adult life, into a functional adult life. See, happiness is a byproduct of good living, right? You're not always going to be happy every day, but you can be functioning in society, right? And there's a lot of men who have a failure to launch because they're living at home and there's no direction and there's no game plan. And so I'm trying to inspire families to make tough decisions, create boundaries, and help their kids become adults.
I agree. I feel like we've seen a huge rise in, soft parenting and parents letting children stay with them long after they should be, like you mentioned, launched and on their own. And, they think that it's in love, and it definitely is done with love, but that doesn't mean it's the best thing for them. And we've talked a little bit about you writing this book, and I want to get into the inspiration behind that, but I want to backtrack. You mentioned in the very beginning, the moment surrender to God.
Mm.
What kind of pushed you in that direction to surrender to God? Was he did you incorporate him into your life prior to that? Did someone kind of preach the word to you? What led you to God?
So it's interesting, and I just this is important for the story. I was raised as a conservative Jewish person,
Hmm.
and I've been to Israel 9 times. I was bar mitzvahed in Israel. We followed Moses' journey through the desert on
Wow.
camels. My dad has been to Israel, and this is not political whatsoever. So I'm not get I have no official anybody who's listening, this is not me supporting Israel. I'm just talking about how I grew up and what was taught to me, right? I didn't have a choice for that. And I went to a religious school. And when you grow up with one sect of people, then you really don't know about other ideas. And so I had been in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous for quite some time, and I had heard time and time again, have you ever tried getting on your knees to pray and ask for help? And that's not something that I was comfortable with because of the old ideas and the indoctrination that I had that Jews don't kneel. And so it was the perfect storm. I had deep-rooted spiritual pain. Pills, booze, alcohol, drugs was killing me. And I had burned every bridge in my life. I was ready to kill myself. So I went to a meeting, another one, and it was a group of men. And what I say is that a lot of people don't want to hear the truth about where they are and who they are. And so one of the things I said is that I fired all the yes men in my life, including myself, and I started listening to the people who had long-term sobriety. And once again, they said, have you tried getting on your knees and ask God for help? Well, that's what I mentioned my sobriety date, October 3rd, 2004, 6:30 in the morning. I got on my knees in the living room and I said, God, if you don't show yourself, I'm going to kill myself. I had an AR-15 rifle next to me and the room lit up for 25 minutes. And there was a powerful sensation that came over me. And the obsession to use drugs and alcohol was lifted instantaneously.
Mm.
And so one of the things that I say that I'm trying not to, this is I guess more of a Catholic or I know because there's been a lot of people of faith who are interested in my message because one of the things I say is that when I felt the presence of God, I realized that I wasn't chosen for my religion. I was chosen to be of service and to help other people
Mm.
because most of not a lot of my childhood friends are dead, and
Mm.
I believe I was spared to to be of service to those who are struggling. Specifically, and this came in later, as a man who grew up in a bubble and who grew up in privilege, I don't think people understand what's going on in the rest of the world. I think a lot of us have lost perspective, including me.
Yeah.
And every time I go to serve, I live in a suburb of Detroit. It's a very blue collar, rough town outside of the suburbs. And I see people who are trying to recover, who are felons, who don't have parents, they don't have family, they don't have insurance, they don't have a driver's license, face tattoos, neck tattoos. I call them in my book the forgotten ones because these are the men that society has brushed aside.
Yeah.
These are that is my true. Now I'll help anybody, whether you have a lot of money or you don't, but that's what really drives me and motivates me because everything was given to me. And when I got on my knees and I realized that I was given 500 chances, service is my way of showing God and proving to God, please know that I want you to see that I am worthy for sparing me.
And
So
so,
getting on my knees, so the whole point is that I used to think, well, what is that going to do? Right. And I never tell anybody how to pray. I strongly suggest what worked for me is, and the men and women who I respect, now some of them don't hit their knees, but a lot of the people sober 30, 40 years in service, volunteer work, give you the shirt off their back. They're not a victim, they're a survivor. These are the people who get on their knees and ask God for sobriety every day and how to be of maximum service to God and how to be a better person and how to be of service. And that's what changed my life. I mean, but I will say if anybody's listening or the people who are listening, you don't have to have a white light spiritual experience like I did, right? Most people do not see a white light. But I am trying to reach the agnostics and the atheists as well, because I think that they are truly lost. And so my message to them is pretty simple. And it was the way it was sent to me. You don't need $100,000 to build a relationship with God, meaning you don't have to go to a high-end facility. And you don't need a spiritual experience to make a pot of coffee. And what that means
mm.
is that I believe that if you're really struggling with God, service can be your higher power. if you just start to get out of yourself and be of service to someone else, you will build upon those experiences. And if you want self-esteem, you have to start doing esteemable things.
I agree 100%. And what I want to get into is who would most benefit from reading your book. Obviously, you talked about writing it to be of service and to help people to spread awareness, to create prevention and intervention. Who should really read it?
Family, parents or spouses or any family member, grandparents who have a hard time. Listen, as you know, I held my family hostage. It was a disaster. You know that. I wouldn't show up. I would steal. I would pawn. I would lie. I would wasted people's time, wasted people's money. Families have a right to live a nice life, and you can love someone from a distance. So I'm hoping that families will look at the case studies that I've had, and I want to, I just want them to be able to set healthy boundaries. That doesn't mean you have to kick them out and never speak to them again. But you have to create boundaries and you have to draw a line in the sand and stick to it like my family did. That's why one of the reasons why I got well. Now, I'm also trying to help addicts and alcoholics, specifically those maybe who don't have a lot of resources, right? The treatment center industry is a behemoth, multi billion dollar industry. Now, because of my health insurance and financial situation, I was able to go to the high dollar facilities back when your insurance would pay for everything. It's a completely different story now. I'm trying to reach men and women who don't have a lot of resources. And there's one story that comes to mind. When I was 19, I went to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. I was the only white person because it was in the city of Detroit, which is predominantly black. And I remember this will always sit with me, even though I didn't get sober for another 10 years. This man said, because I have a relationship with God, I am now able to ride my bike past the crack houses and liquor stores where I used to get high on my way to church,
Mm.
right? So, and I want people to really hear what I'm saying. Most people just can't pick up and leave, right? They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're living in a city surrounded by prostitution, gambling, drugs, alcohol, the whole thing. There's a lot of people who recover in their backyard. And the two things that I attest to that, one is service and the other is God.
I think that's a really relevant example, not just physically with our geographical location, but with our feed and algorithm as well, you know. And with that, though, we do have the power to shape that. We do have the power to get rid of the quote virtual, stores of liquor and sex and drugs, whatever it may be. But also just if you are struggling to rebuild the feed, we have in Greek it's called sophronismos, the spirit of self-control that God gave us to turn off the app or to delete it or to lock it out. And I think that's one of the hardest parts is I talk about inundation. We are being inundated, bombarded on all sides, from mainstream media to social media to just our societal events to indulge in a lot of things that are destroying us. I talk about, and you and I won't get into it in this conversation, but I've had plenty of conversations about the spread of the vape and vaping and fentanyl
Mm,
and the rise of that, you
mm,
know, the access to those resources and how drugs are being spread through different means and how we keep rebranding smoking into some different form or medium to kind of be like, hey, it's not as bad. We're always trying to make it not as bad. We always justify, right? The industry is going to do that for profit. And then we as addicts, I talk a lot on the show about justification and denial, about how we can always justify our actions. I've dealt with a lot of addicts who every holiday was an excuse to drink or do drugs. Every
oh
party
yeah.
was an excuse to drink or do drugs, whatever it is. And so I think it's really important that like you mentioned, we can, even in the midst of this environment, be prepared and controlled, and we're always going to face some kind of temptation, and even I interviewed people who knew addicts who had been sober and in fact, my dad always questioned me about this. He goes, son, I go to AA and there's this guy, he's 70 years old and he's been sober for 20 years. Why is he still going there? And I said, Dad, probably because he understands himself and he knows that he needs to go there to help fight against the temptations. That maybe for him, that is one of his methods, a healthy method of resisting this. For some people, it might be service. For some people, it might be developing a new hobby to fill in empty time where your mind wanders, whatever it may be. And I think it's really important that we develop these practices so that even when you're put into that situation, right? Some addicts I've spent time with, they'll go to a party and up to a certain level of drinks, they're fine. But if there's too many bottles around, they leave. But if there's only one or two people drinking, they can stay. I think analyzing our limits and knowing what kind of environments we can thrive in is really important. But at the end of the day, ultimately, being able to resist any environment, as you said. And so to help us with that, I always ask any faith-based guest on the show, if you could share one Bible quote from the heart right now, what would it be? And it doesn't have to be addiction related, just whatever, the Spirit puts on you.
Well, I'll tell you, this is it's a New Testament prayer. It is Our Father. And so you have to understand that when I grew up as a Jewish person or a kid in day school, we don't read the New Testament. We only read the Old
Right.
Testament. So when I went to Alcoholics Anonymous for the first time and I heard that prayer, um, listen, this is why it's so important to be open to other ideas. Because at the end of a meeting, usually, well, before COVID, you would hold hands and say they are Father at many meetings. And because I would use this as an excuse, I'd say, oh, well, that's a Christian prayer. That's a New Testament. That prayer is out of the New Testament. But that prayer, I say it proudly. And because what? God's not going to love me because I'm saying a prayer, holding hands with other people who are all trying to get well like I am, right? You have to be able to be honest with yourself. Do I not like the prayer because I think it's rooted in Christianity, or am I just trying to look for a way to drink? Very, very
Mm,
important distinction, right? Because you can talk your way out of any program. So I love the Our Father, but I also like the Saint Francis prayer. Are you familiar with that one?
the Lord make me an instrument of your peace.
Yes.
Yeah, so I went to, it's been a long time, but I was raised Catholic. I'm no longer Catholic, but I went to a Catholic school where that prayer was said every day.
See,
And
I had never heard that before.
yeah, and for me, even though I'm not Catholic, it's still a pretty good prayer. It's how would I describe it? It's it's two sides. Everything that it goes that it speaks against, it heals against, if that makes sense.
Yes, it's a dichotomy of good and not evil,
Right.
but and I'll tell you because that's why I'm so big on faith and God is that and so just so you know, my book is not about just about Matt Grace. I share other people's incredible stories of how their faith saved them through the worst consequences. And one person in particular who introduced me to that prayer, he had to bury his wife and son in the same year. And
Mm.
at his son's funeral, he was pushing his wife in a wheelchair. She had full-blown dementia. She didn't know where she was. And I'm looking at this man who just buried his son and he's taking care of his wife who doesn't know where she is. And I said, "Why don't you put her in a home?" And he said, "Because that's my wife and I owe her for all the years of our bad marriage as me drinking and not showing up and just not being committed to marriage." And he's just his character through the toughest times. He said that he leaned on the St. Francis prayer and he leaned on his relationship with his higher power, God. And so think about burying your wife and son in the same year, or your son being brutally murdered, or you get terminal cancer, or you experience financial ruin. What I found is that the people who believed in something, you can either live in fear or live in faith. And the people who got through those dark hours, they leaned on their faith.
I agree 100% because I actually speak all the time about, when times are going difficult through hardships and lamentations, you can curse God and ask why this is happening and abandon God. and just try to figure out on your own. And what you've done really is you've cut off the only thing that could probably save you from whatever situation it is. I feel like, you're taking away the only source of rest, peace, and power that you have. And, if God is real and, all this hardship is happening, then you need to understand that fighting with him is only going to make it worse, right? And I think it's really important to, and again, one of the most difficult things to do is surrender in those times, especially of hardship and lamentation. But we've seen throughout the theological unity between the Old Testament and the New Testament the overlapping theme of redemption and of hardship becoming a catalyst for good. Not that God removes darkness, but sends light into darkness. And that light into darkness might be someone such as yourself, Mr. Grace, about gaining sobriety and then spreading a message of prevention and awareness in a way that you couldn't if you had been. That's not to say that God allows sin to happen just to make good things, but the fact that whatever is evil or against us can be used for good, and that God will use everything against us for good, as it is written in Genesis. When Joseph's brothers find him in Egypt and he's in a position of power, they fear for their lives that he's going to extract revenge. But what he says to them is this, and I'll paraphrase it here: what you all intended for evil, God intended for good, for the saving and blessing of many that is happening now. And so I'd like to remind everyone, wherever you are, if you're in the midst of addiction, if you're recovered, your value isn't in the addiction. Your value is in what God deems you as, which is a beloved child and a servant of Him that is going to do great work. And so never feel too irredeemable. It's always about there is great redemption and purpose beyond whatever it is. Maybe it's addiction, maybe it's some other sinful vice in your life or something that you've done. Just always keep in mind that there is great redemption and purpose afterward. Matt Grace is one of many people I've interviewed who are shining examples of that, and the idea, of course, is that if he did it, you can do it too, whether your situation is not as bad as his or is worse than his. Like I've mentioned, I've interviewed people who dealt with addiction for just a few years and some who have dealt with it for 30 years. And so it's never too late. We talked about loving and boundaries. And one thing I throw in there also is hope, hoping in the addict's recovery. And that doesn't mean you have to really like them or enable what they're doing, but you can still hope in them and give them encouragement and give them that encouragement that they need, because a lot of them don't have that self-worth or that encouragement that they need or that hope in themselves. And again, you can do that from a safe distance. Now, Mr. Grace, we've had an excellent conversation covering a lot of different facets of this topic. I think it's really important that anyone listening, if they want to check out your book, we're going to have it in the description below to check out, along with your website, which has a whole bunch of information. But as we close up here, what would be your final message for everyone to take away?
Yeah, if I can make it, anybody can make it. I was the least likable person out of all of my friend group. I was a mean-spirited, cruel kid that because my spirit was broken from a young age, and I didn't know that I needed God until I became an adult. But my message is to be nice to each other, to be of service. If you're struggling today, let's say you have 5 days of sobriety, go help someone with 1 day. I don't care if it's AA, NA, Dharma recovery, smart recovery, whatever it is you're doing, there's someone else who is also struggling. If you can just go to a soup kitchen or get some type of service-based position anywhere, I truly believe that it will fill your spirit.
I agree 100%. When we often talk about service, people instantly think about a global mission to a third world nation. It doesn't have to be with that. Start local. There are so many local impacts that need to be made that people are overlooking because they're so focused on the global issues. We're so wrapped in around the world that we have lost sight of the local. And it doesn't even have to be faith-based. There's plenty of opportunities for nonprofits and charity work without any religious intermingling, if that's not what you want right now, that you can be a service of. So I highly recommend that you look around your town and find out. There's plenty of forums online. Now there's more online information about where and how you can help than ever before. Mr. Grace, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for all the impact that you're making and for your time today. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see continued success in your future.
Thank you.